Hi, I'm Trish Thomas-Mink, and I'm here to tell you the story about Dorothy Kilgallen and the Kennedy assassination. Now, don't be surprised if you don't recognize the famous name. I stumbled across her one night as I was channel surfing on an old game show network. She was on the show What's My Line? It was a panel celebrity show. They had 4 celebrities that would come out and guess the occupation of the person that was introduced to the audience. Now, Dorothy had this elegant mid-century modern look to her. She had short, dark, well-done hair, pearls, lipstick, beautiful dress. But she wasn't just a pretty face. Dorothy was also sharp, and she guessed the contestants more than any of the other celebrities, at least according to John Daly, who used to host the show. I didn't think of her much again until I was researching the Kennedy assassination. I'm obsessed with the Kennedy assassination, and I have been since the day I was in the 1st grade and he was shot and I was sent home from school. I'll never forget watching the principal enter our classroom and go over to the teacher and whisper in her ear to have her softly cry while he put his arm around her shoulders. We were all sent home from school that day. And I sat in front of our 13-inch black and white TV watching an OJ-esque type movement with the motorcade going toward Daly Plaza over and over again until some wise adult kind of shooed me outside. Now, they knew each other, Dorothy and JFK, and one night Dorothy was out having cocktails with a jazz singer by the name of Bobby Short, and Jack Kennedy sauntered over to the table and spoke to them. He reminded her, "Do you remember when we played charades at your house, Dorothy?" And after Jack Kennedy was elected, Dorothy and her youngest son, Kerry, also went to the White House for a visit. Now, JFK gifted Kerry with a little pin of the PT-109. The PT-109 was the ship that JFK served on during World War II. Dorothy knew of JFK's womanizing, but like most during that time frame, chose never to reveal it. And it's interesting because, as a columnist, Dorothy did reveal other people's womanizing, namely Frank Sinatra. Back to JFK. Dorothy Kilgallen had a syndicated column in over 200 newspapers across the country. She wrote about celebrities both on Broadway and in Hollywood, and she also reported on famous trials in the 20th century. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping was one, the Sam Shepard case, which later became the TV show, and the movie called The Fugitive. Those were just to name a couple. After JFK was assassinated, Dorothy had questions about who Lee Harvey Oswald was and why Jack Ruby showed up and killed him right before they went to trial. That was 2 assassinations in 3 days. She knew something wasn't right. Though Dorothy worked for Hearst Publishing and was given big trials to report on by the New York American Journal, she didn't get the assignment for the JFK assassination. So privately, she decided to do her own investigations. She was one of the first journalists to realize there was a conspiracy going on. Many people didn't take her seriously and thought of her as a gossip columnist, but she was far more. Her fame did allow her to access and obtain interviews and to gain information. She was the only one that interviewed Jack Ruby privately. Here's a little bit more about Dorothy personally. She was born in 1913 in Chicago. Her father was a reporter also for the Randolph Hearst Publishing Company and traveled across the country. Now, Dorothy was the apple of his eye, and she knew early she wanted to be exactly like her father. When she was 18, her father got her a job with his connections at the New York Evening Journal. In 1931, the U.S. was in the throes of the Great Depression, and though any woman would be grateful to take any job that would help her family, most women were not afforded the luxury of Dorothy Kilgallen going to work as a reporter for a newspaper. She was well ahead of her time. In 1940, Dorothy married a man by the name of Richard Colmar. The couple had 3 children, Jill, Dickie, and Carrie. And the family was so popular during the 50s that they had a morning radio show in their pajamas from home. Now, Dorothy's career was more successful than her husband Richard's, and actually, her career was more successful than her marriage. Richard became known as Mr. Kilgallen over time. And so he started having affairs, and as the marriage disintegrated over the years, Dorothy had lovers also. They never divorced, though. They just basically led separate lives. Dorothy was involved with a young bisexual singer named Johnny Ray. It was said the two were madly in love. And in 1959, he went on trial for the second time, not the first but second, in Detroit for soliciting a man for sex. She stood by him the whole time, and he was acquitted by a jury of all women. Dorothy was 15 years older than Johnny Ray and helped him with career matters. Now let's fast forward a little bit romantically, and in 1964 it was revealed she was seeing a man from out of town, another reporter from Ohio. His name was Ron Pataki. He was a critic for the Columbus Citizen Journal. They met on a press junket for The Sound of Music, The Agony and the Ecstasy, and Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. Ron Pataki was 20 years her junior, and has insisted their relationship was strictly platonic. He also may have been the last person to ever see her alive. Dorothy became powerful both in New York City and in Hollywood writing this column. She did a radio show with her husband from home, and she was a panelist on What's My Line. Dorothy was invited to Queen Elizabeth's coronation. Dorothy made powerful allies as a reporter and as a journalist, but she also made some powerful enemies. She was friends with Frank Sinatra for years. And unlike JFK, she did not look the other way at his affairs, but she reported on them. Frank Sinatra, in his nightclub act, used to call her chinless and said, "If you happen to run into Dorothy Kilgallen, be sure you're in your car." The FBI and the CIA had files on her. She uncovered what she thought was a plot to kill Castro, and she also worked on the McCarthy trials. John Daly said she was different than the rest of the panels on What's My Line. First, she was more conservative than the other members, and they were very aware that she wrote a column daily, and they were afraid to say anything for fear it would end up in the column the next morning, and sometimes it did. So they were very cautious around her. Back to President Kennedy, Kilgallen watched from her New York townhouse as the motorcade slowly made its way down toward Daley Plaza. She was horrified when her friend President John F. Kennedy was shot to death on November 22, 1963. After recovering from the shock, she got on the phone and began calling contacts and friends she had in Dallas, Texas. It was going to be the beginning of what would become a lifelong obsession for her. Well, for the rest of her life. Dorothy was known as Dolly Mae to her friends and considered a gossip columnist by most, so I didn't find much about her as I was researching into the assassination of President Kennedy. She was there, though, and after Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, she was convinced there was a conspiracy. As far as her reporting on celebrities, Dorothy had this system. It was a sort of I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. She had a ton of contacts, and she was syndicated in 200 papers nationwide. She also had Hollywood and Broadway at her feet. Dorothy Kilgallen was a career maker, and she was a career breaker. Her policy was, if you want me to talk favorably about your celebrity, you bring me 3 stories about other celebrities. A kind of 3-for-1 deal. She was part of the Hearst publishing family. They were behind the McCarthyism and the anti-Castro media. But all the information that Hearst came upon was shared with all of its reporters. Don't forget, she covered famous trials and hard stories also. Finally, Dorothy Kilgallen was an important media contact for the CIA. That's right, she had access to the Central Intelligence Agency because she wrote for the New York Journal American. Now, the FBI had a file on Kilgallen and kept track of what she was writing about. She was friends with JFK, and she became aware of the desire of the FBI to remove JFK from office after the death of Marilyn Monroe. She believed the brothers, both Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, were being set up to take the fall for her death. It was kind of an awakening for Dorothy. She began to investigate Jack Kennedy's death almost immediately. It started with articles in the journal American, as she had contacts also within the Dallas Police Department. Shock! Now, on November 29, 1963, President Lyndon Johnson established the Warren Commission. He used an executive order, I believe it was 11130. Johnson appointed the commission to report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He mandated the attendance and the testimony of the witnesses and the production of evidence concerning what was called the infraction occurring in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. And guess what? Dorothy also had a contact on the Warren Commission. The stories Dorothy was writing about the assassination brought her into contact with an author by the name of Mark Lane. Mark would go on to author a critique on the Warren Commission called Rush to Judgment. It came out about a year after Dorothy's death. He related to Dorothy this story. Officer J.D. Tibbett, the policeman that Oswald was to have shot right after Kennedy, Jack Ruby, and Bernard Wiseman were to have met at the New Orleans Carousel Club 8 days before Kennedy was shot. Lane got the information from Thayer Waldo, a reporter on the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Waldo was afraid to publish it. Dorothy was writing articles about what she was learning, and it is thought that the CIA and the FBI surrounded her more the more she revealed. She was the only reporter to get a private interview with Jack Ruby. She went through his lawyer, Joe Tonhill. She had a mutual friend in the music business and passed a message to Ruby from him. Now, the interview only lasted 8 minutes, and she never revealed what Ruby told her. There's a theory that she was going to reveal it in the book that she was gathering evidence for. As time went on, Dorothy was getting more and more frightened. She believed her home was bugged and she was being watched. She even purchased a gun and told a friend she was afraid that her youngest son, Kerry, could be kidnapped. She was very careful about who she brought close to her. Her new confidant was her much younger lover from Ohio, Ron Pataki. Again, remember, Ron Pataki is thought to be the last person to see Dorothy alive. Now, Dorothy had this file, and this is 1965, so there were not Kinkos on every corner, and people didn't make photocopies. Any copy that was made was done with carbon paper. So Dorothy had this file where everything that she learned about the Kennedy assassination, she kept in it. And she never let it leave her side, no matter what. It went with her everywhere. It disappeared right after her death. Now, back to the Warren Commission. They revealed their findings before Dorothy passed away, and Dorothy called the whole thing laughable. Now, a few weeks before she died, she asked her hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, to go with her to New Orleans. She didn't tell him why, and as things went on, it got more mysterious. She booked them on separate flights on different airlines. And when they got to New Orleans, she booked them in different hotel rooms at different hotels. Now, they did go to dinner that night, but early the next morning, she called Sinclair, told him to get onto a plane, go back to New York, and don't tell anybody that she was there with him, or he was there with her. Now, what had happened that frightened her so badly between dinner and the next morning, we'll never know. Dorothy took that with her to the grave. Dorothy Kilgallen filmed her last show on What's My Line on November 7th, 1965. She met Bob Bach after the filming at P.J. Clark's for a drink. She told him that she had a late date, excused herself, and went to the Regency Hotel bar. There she was joined by a man, and they sat in the back. The next morning, the most powerful voice in America was dead. She was discovered by that same hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, about noonish on November 8th, 1965. The same man that went to New Orleans with her. Now here's some interesting things or observations that Mark Sinclair made about Dorothy that morning. Dorothy Kilgallen's body was discovered on the third floor bedroom of the townhouse. Dorothy always slept in the fifth floor bedroom. She was found sitting up in bed, wearing her makeup, her false eyelashes, false hairpiece, and earrings. Normally, she would never go to bed all made up. She was not wearing her regular pajamas, but was dressed instead in a blue matching peignoir and robe. She did have a reading book on her bed that was turned upside down, but it was a book that Mark knew she had finished weeks ago, and her reading glasses were nowhere in that room. Now, remember, Dorothy's in her 50s at this point, so reading glasses are a must. The air conditioning was on, even though there was no need for it. Remember, November 7th, so it's fall in New York and cool. And Dorothy was a slight woman. She was thin, and so she was constantly getting cold. She would have rather had the heat on. And here's an interesting sort of note as Sinclair was leaving. He sees a police cruiser that have two officers sitting in it. They completely ignore him, as if nothing has gone on. Oddly enough, he doesn't go tell them that he's found his friend dead upstairs in her townhouse. Police detectives do not show up till later in the day after the announcement is made by Douglas Edwards on the CBS News. Dorothy Kilgallen died of a combination of barbiturates and alcohol. Each alone not enough, but together a lethal cocktail. Later, the Freedom of Information law allowed author Mark Shaw to obtain the lab results. Now, Dorothy Kilgallen had a prescription for Seconal. It was revealed that she had also Tylenol and Nembutal in her body also at the time. The tests also revealed there was a powder residue on a glass near her bed, as if somebody had spiked her drink. Now, on October 24th, 1965, this is a couple of weeks before she died, and just minutes before she was supposed to go on What's My Line, an announcement came over the PA system. A voice said, "The keys to Ron Pataki's room are waiting at the front desk of the Regency Hotel." No one knows who made that announcement, or why they didn't just bring her a note. She was so shaken up. Don't forget, this is 1965, and she was a married woman. She was so shaken up as the show began and the panelists were introduced that she walked in briskly, sat down too soon, and then had to get up quickly again. She was a little flustered. After the weird note, Dorothy gave a copy of a chapter to her friend Florence Pritchett. She was afraid at that point, and she gave it to her for safekeeping. Florence died the day after Dorothy died, and the chapter was never found. Here's another weird thing about this. There's so many weird things to her death, but her body was not taken to the coroner's office in Manhattan, where she lived. It was transported all the way to Brooklyn. The reason? Mark Shaw, the author, states that Dr. Stephen Goldner revealed to him that the Brooklyn coroner's office at that time was controlled by the mob. Now, who this Mark Shaw is, he wrote a book that came out last year called The Reporter That Knew Too Much. This enabled him, with all the information he gathered, all the new evidence, and all the witnesses he interviewed, to take it to the district attorney of New York, Manhattan, to open and re-examine Dorothy Kilgallen's case. Shaw believes that New Orleans Mafia Don Carlos Marcello had something to do with her death. Why? Shaw believes Dorothy was going to write a tell-all book in which Marcello was outed as the mastermind behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Shaw also thinks that her death could have been carried out easily by the last person she was with, which is thought to be Ron Pataki. that he could have been the man in the booth at the Regency Hotel early the morning before. Further, that the whole bedroom scene was staged. It's kind of weird, too, because Pataki wrote these two odd poems after her death. One was about dead men tell no tales. It was called Never Trust a Stiff at a Typewriter. The other one was called Vodka Roulette, and it was published with a image of a bartender mixing drinks, and it read, "Make one of 'em poison." Now, I do have some notes that are follow-ups to some additional information that I got. Dorothy was a curious woman, and she was also curious about UFOs. There was supposedly a CIA tape of Dorothy Kilgallen having a conversation with Marilyn Monroe. During the conversation, Marilyn tells Dorothy that Jack Kennedy knew some secret about UFOs. 2 days later, Marilyn was dead. Did anything that JFK know about UFOs in part cause his death? Personally, I don't think so, not on its own, but that's my personal opinion. But here's another interesting part of the story with Dorothy. She went to visit London in 1955 and wrote this story in her column, and this is a quote. Quote, "British scientists and airmen, after examining the wreckage of a mysterious flying ship, are convinced these strange aerial objects are not optical illusions or Soviet inventions, but are flying saucers that originate on another planet. The source of my information is a British official of cabinet rank who prefers to remain unidentified. We believe," he said, "on the basis of our inquiry thus far, that the saucers are staffed by small men, probably under 4 feet tall. It is frightening, but there is no denying that the flying saucers come from another planet." Unquote. It was thought that the source for Kilgallen's column was Lord Mountbatten, who actually related it to Dorothy at a cocktail party in May of 1955. He believed in UFOs, and he believed they were extraterrestrial. Now, Dorothy had thought, after gathering her information, that this was a mob hit, start to finish. She believed that it was New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello that ran the New Orleans crime family from the 40s through the 1970s. Now, in 1959, he was facing deportation at the hands of both Jack and Robert Kennedy. Marcello appeared before a U.S. Senate, the McClellan Committee. They were investigating organized crime at the time. The chief counsel to the committee was Robert F. Kennedy. His brother Jack F. Kennedy was also on the committee. In 1960, Marcello donated $500,000 of that at that time through the Teamsters Union for the campaign of Richard M. Nixon, who lost to Kennedy. In 1961, Marcello was deported to Guatemala. Now, the House Select Committee on Assassination, in its investigation into the assassination of JFK, recognized Jack Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald as a link to organized crime. They went on to say that alone, that was the reason they suspected organized crime might have had something to do with Kennedy's murder. Now, Dorothy had already made the connection between Marcello, Jack Ruby, and Lee Harvey Oswald to the assassination of JFK. She'd been keeping that file with her with all of the information she had learned and was commissioned by Random House to write a book. The famous attorney Melvin Belli said after her death, "They have killed Dorothy. Jack Ruby is next." Oddly enough, many believe that Jack Ruby was injected with something that eventually caused cancer and pulmonary issues, which is how he died in jail. Now, Marcello was represented by famed mob lawyer Frank Regano in legal issues. His connection to Belli was that one time Regano was having lunch with Marcello, Trafficante, and others in New York City. Time magazine called him the top Cosa Nostra hoodlum. Regano hired Belli to sue the magazine, and he won. There was a connection also to Jimmy Hoffa. On January 14th, 1992, Regano told Jack Newfield of the New York Post that he relayed a request from Hoffa to Trafficante and Marcello asking the two mafia bosses to kill Kennedy. According to Regano, he met Hoffa at the Teamsters headquarters in Washington, D.C., then delivered the message to Trafficante and Marcello a few days later in a meeting at the Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans. So how much was documented in the file that Dorothy used to write her book from, or was in the process of writing her book from? Her husband, Richard Colmar, said he destroyed the file after her death. However, her ex-lover, Johnny Ray, said she would have never let her husband near her files. Now, there is a daughter of one of Dorothy Kilgallen's original employees still alive. She said that her father had discovered Dorothy's body. Author Mark Shaw, who did not reveal the daughter's name, said the clothes that they found her in were different than what they put on her before the police arrived. She was made up in a fashion to go out, not to go to bed. The death scene was staged, and her body had been moved. She did not even sleep in that room. When everybody started coming in that afternoon, there were government agents that came into the home and threatened the employee to keep him quiet. So, is the file still around? Mark Shaw believes it, and if it is, it has the answer to the question of who killed the brilliant reporter, and may even have the answer to who killed President John F. Kennedy. The beautiful and brilliant Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a consummate journalist, a wife, a mother, who passed beyond the glass ceiling way before she knew there was a glass ceiling, is like many of the whistleblowers today that are stopped too soon before they're able to get the truth out.